Fake HOA police handcuffed my wife for hanging lights, so we burned her 17 Harleys as payback. It was the perfect holiday season, or so we thought. The lights twinkled in the cold night air, but that was the moment everything changed. 2 men, dressed like cops, appeared at our door. They handcuffed my wife for hanging lights. It was supposed to be a simple holiday tradition, but it turned into something much darker. And then, things took a turn I never saw coming. What would we do when the HOA's control went too far? What price would they pay for messing with the wrong family? The answer? It was burning. Literally. Stay with me. I'll tell you everything. Welcome back to HOA Secrets Uncovered, where the darkest secrets of suburban life are revealed. I'm Mark, and I live in a quiet, unsuspecting neighborhood. You know, the kind where everything seems perfect on the outside. But today, I'm sharing a story that's more than just a typical HOA conflict. It's about the sun had barely started to set, casting an orange glow across our little suburban street. Everything looked peaceful, almost picture-perfect. But that's the thing about suburban life. It can seem too perfect, and sometimes that perfection hides something sinister. It was supposed to be a nice evening. My wife, Sarah, had spent hours decorating the front yard with lights. Nothing crazy, just a few strings of bright lights around the porch and some along the windows. A simple holiday tradition, nothing more. But I should have known better. Nothing ever stays simple in this neighborhood. I was sitting in the living room, sipping on my coffee, watching the news, when I saw her. The HOA president, Mrs. Caldwell, strolling past our house with that familiar fake smile on her face. She always had that smile, the one that made your skin crawl, like she knew something you didn't, and Sakis. He was enjoying every second of it. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I saw it. Her eyes. They were different today. Cold, hard. Like she was scanning our house, calculating. I knew that look. I had seen it before. It was the look of someone who had already made up their mind. Someone who had decided something wasn't going to stand. I told myself to relax. It was probably nothing. Mrs. Caldwell was always, well, Mrs. Caldwell. She was the type of person who felt like she had a right to control everything, from the color of your mailbox to the height of your grass. But she had never gone this far before. And yet, something told me this was going to be different. About half an hour later, the doorbell rang. I got up, walked to the door, and opened it without thinking. Standing there were 2 men in dark uniforms, their faces serious, almost too serious. They looked like they could have been cops, but something felt off. I didn't recognize them, and I had never seen officers like this in the neighborhood before. "Good evening, sir," one of them said, holding up a small, official-looking card. "We're here to enforce some HOA regulations. Is your wife home?" I stared at the card for a second, then looked back at the men. I felt a chill run through me. "What's this about?" I asked. They exchanged a quick glance, and that's when I realized. This wasn't just about the lights. It was about something bigger. I could feel it. "She's being cited for a violation of the neighborhood's holiday decoration rules," the other officer said, his tone cold and distant. "We're here to escort her to the station for questioning." I blinked, trying to make sense of what he just said. "Questioning? Over lights?" He nodded without any emotion. "Yes, sir. The decorations do not comply with the HOA's standards. We'll need to take her in for processing." Processing? What was this? A criminal investigation? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were acting like she'd committed a felony, like she was a criminal. I turned and looked back into the house, where Sarah was busy putting the final touches on a wreath. She had no idea what was going on outside. Before I could say anything else, the men barged past me and into the living room. They didn't wait for an invitation. They were already heading toward Sarah, their heavy boots thudding against the floor. My stomach dropped. "Excuse me," I called, trying to stop them, but they didn't listen. Sarah looked up in surprise as they approached her. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. She had no idea. "These men are from the HOA," I said, still trying to wrap my mind around what was happening. "They're saying the lights are a violation, and they're taking you in." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "For the lights?" she asked incredulously. Before either of us could react, they were already placing handcuffs on her wrists. My heart raced. My mind screamed in confusion. This was insane. The men didn't even flinch. They didn't care about the look on her face, the way she was pleading with them. They were just doing their job, their cold, robotic job. I felt powerless, like I couldn't do anything to stop it. I was just standing there, helpless, as my wife, was arrested for hanging Christmas lights. As they led her out of the house, I stood frozen in the doorway. The whole neighborhood had come to a stop. People were peeking through their windows, whispering, pointing. But I didn't care about them. All I cared about was Sarah. I had to get her back. I had to fix this. But how? As the police car pulled away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about the lights. This wasn't some random act of authority gone too far. This was personal. Someone was pulling strings behind the scenes, and I had a sinking feeling I knew who it was. Mrs. Caldwell's face flashed in my mind, the smile, the cold eyes, the sense that she was always watching. She was the one behind this. She was the one who had orchestrated all of it. But why? What did she have to gain from this? What was her endgame? I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let this slide. I would get Sarah back, and I would make sure Mrs. Caldwell paid for what she had done. But what could I do? I had no idea where to start. Where did I even begin? It's funny how things in a neighborhood can seem perfectly normal until something completely bizarre shakes it all up. Our neighborhood had its rules, sure, but they weren't anything crazy. No parking in front of someone else's house. Keep your lawn neatly trimmed, the usual stuff. We followed them, as most people did, without question. They were simple, harmless guidelines, until the HOA made them feel like life or death. The night Sarah was taken away, the neighbors whispered behind their curtains like they were waiting for a show. It wasn't about the lights anymore. It wasn't even about Christmas. The HOA had made their move, and everyone knew they'd gone too far. But what happened next? That's what really shocked me. I spent the night pacing, trying to figure out how this all went so wrong. Who were these so-called officers who'd come to arrest Sarah? I'd never seen them before, and I was certain they weren't real cops. They had no badges, no real authority, just a power trip wearing a uniform. And then I kept coming back to the same thought. Why Sarah? Why now? Mrs. Caldwell, the HOA president, was the only person I could think of. She was the one who ran this entire street, who controlled everything from the height of fences to the shade of green on your lawn. She had an obsession with making sure everything was perfect, a suburban utopia in her eyes. But what made her decide to go after us? The next morning, I drove over to the HOA office. It was just a small building tucked away, behind a couple of large trees. It was quiet. Too quiet. As I walked in, I noticed the walls were lined with photos of perfect houses. Houses that were far too neat, far too controlled. This was Mrs. Caldwell's world. I walked up to the desk, where an older woman with thick glasses looked up from her paperwork. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice sharp, but not unfriendly. "I need to speak with Mrs. Caldwell," I said, my voice steady, though my blood was boiling. "It's about my wife." The woman nodded and picked up the phone. "Hold on just a moment." I could hear the faint click of the line before the words came through the speaker. "What is it?" It was Mrs. Caldwell's voice. Cold, unbothered. "It's about last night," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "My wife was taken in by your so-called HOA officers for hanging lights on our porch. What kind of madness is that?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could feel her smile, even through the phone. "That's not what happened," she said finally. "Your wife violated a clear neighborhood guideline. The rules are there for a reason, and they apply to everyone." "I don't care about your rules," I snapped, before quickly calming myself down. "What I care about is how my wife was treated. You don't get to take someone in for something so ridiculous." I could hear her sigh, a sound full of superiority. "You clearly don't understand. The HOA is a community. We have standards that must be upheld. It's for the greater good of everyone." I was about to reply when she cut me off. "Now, unless you're here to apologize for your wife's actions, I suggest you leave. There's nothing else to discuss." I stood there, frozen. "You're telling me to leave?" I said, my voice a low growl. "You've just taken my wife for something that should never have been a crime, and you're telling me to leave?" Mrs. Caldwell's tone was even colder now. "I'm telling you that you're not welcome here unless you're ready to follow the rules. You're welcome to leave, or I can have security escort you out." That was the final straw. As I turned and left the office, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about the lights. It was about something deeper. Mrs. Caldwell had been watching us for a while, and whatever she was planning, she wasn't going to let a few decorations stand in her way. Later that night, after hours of pacing and trying to think of what to do next, I found something that would change everything. I was going through the old HOA rulebook, an ancient dusty binder that had been sitting on the shelf for ages, and I stumbled upon something. A clause. It was buried under pages of fine print and neighborhood guidelines, but it caught my eye. This clause was different. It gave the HOA president and board the right to impose what they called emergency enforcement if they felt an issue was damaging to the community. But nowhere did it say anything about Christmas lights. Nowhere did it say anything about the petty little power games Mrs. Caldwell was playing. It was clear now she was abusing her position. This wasn't about the lights. This wasn't even about the rules. This was personal. She was using her position to control and manipulate the people around her, and that included my wife and me. But there was one thing Mrs. Caldwell didn't count on. Me. And I wasn't going to just sit back and let her tear apart our family over something so small. So I decided to fight back, not with force, but with something even more powerful: compliance. I was going to follow every rule, every single one of them, to the letter. I would become the perfect neighbor, but I wouldn't stop there. As I started planning my next moves, I realized something else. There were other neighbors out town here who felt the same way, people who were tired of Mrs. Caldwell's overreach. I started talking to them, slowly at first, and the more I learned, the more I realized just how far she'd pushed people. I wasn't alone in this, and together we were going to show her just how wrong she was. But what would happen when she realized her own game was turning against her? What would she do when she saw that the very rules she'd used to control us were the same rules that could tear her down? Have you ever felt like the world around you was spinning out of control and you were just hanging on by a thread? That's how I felt the morning after Sarah was taken in. The neighborhood, once calm and predictable, now felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. Every corner I turned, I could feel the tension, like something big was about to go down. And it was. I had spent hours staring at the HOA rules, trying to make sense of what had happened. There had to be more to this than just some petty violation about hanging lights. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized one thing. This wasn't about the lights. It was about control. It was about power. Mrs. Caldwell was using her position to terrorize the entire neighborhood, and I wasn't going to sit back and let her ruin our lives any longer. But how did I fight back? How did I take down someone who held all the cards? The answer came to me when I went to the mailbox that afternoon. As I pulled out the pile of bills and flyers, one envelope caught my eye. It was from the HOA, another fine, another warning. But this time, something was different. There was a note inside, a small handwritten message. "I know what you're doing. Don't push me." My blood ran cold. Who was this? And why was someone in the HOA sending me a personal threat? I knew right away it had to be Mrs. Caldwell. She was the only one who could be behind this kind of move. She had her eyes on everything, controlling every aspect of our lives, and now she was trying to intimidate me into backing down. But I wasn't backing down. I walked back to the house, my mind racing with ideas. I had to do something drastic, something that would make the HOA feel the same fear they had instilled in us. I had to show them that I wasn't going to roll over. I had to take action, and it had to be calculated. I knew that fighting fire with fire wouldn't work. No, I needed to be smarter. The first step was to dig deeper into Mrs. Caldwell's life. There had to be something, some skeleton in the closet, some weakness, something that would give me leverage. So I started asking around. I talked to neighbors, some of whom had been silent for years, afraid to speak out. But I wasn't just asking about her. I was asking about anyone who could help bring her down. There were whispers about how Mrs. Caldwell had been using the HOA fees to fund her own personal projects, trips, renovations to her house, and other luxuries. People had been suspicious for years but were too afraid to report her. One evening I was talking to an older man who lived 2 houses down from us. His name was Mr. Thompson, a retired teacher who had lived here for decades. He was someone I could trust, someone who wasn't afraid to speak his mind. "I've been watching her for a while," he said, lowering his voice. "You'd be surprised at how much power one person can have when everyone's too scared to stand up. But I've seen the way she's been running things, and it's not right." "You're not the first person she's done this to." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "There were others before you, kid. People who tried to fight her. People who thought they could go toe-to-toe with her and win. But she's been at this for a long time. She knows how to play the game." That was it. The moment I knew I wasn't just fighting for Sarah. I was fighting for everyone who had been silenced by her. And that's when it hit me. If I couldn't take her down by force, I'd take her down by playing her game. The next day, I started following the rules, not just in a half-hearted way, but to the letter. I cut my grass to exactly 2.5 inches. I painted the mailbox the exact shade of beige the rules dictated. I even took down the wind chimes that had been hanging on our porch for years. I knew it seemed ridiculous, but if Mrs. Caldwell thought she could control every little detail, then I was going to show her what that looked like when someone actually followed the rules. But it didn't stop there. I started digging into her finances. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. Mrs. Caldwell had been misusing HOA funds for personal gain. She was taking money that should have been used to improve the neighborhood and funneling it into her own pocket. It was time to make a plan. If I could prove what she had been doing, I could expose her for the fraud she really was. But I couldn't do this alone. I had to get the other neighbors involved, people who had been pushed around for far too long. As I prepared for my next move, I started thinking about the bigger picture. It wasn't just about taking down Mrs. Caldwell. It was about taking back control of the neighborhood. It was about standing up for the people who had been too afraid to speak out. But what if I failed? What if I couldn't get enough support? What if Mrs. Caldwell had a way to twist everything around and turn the tables on me? My mind raced, and the weight of it all felt heavier with every passing moment. I knew I had to act fast. The longer I waited, the more likely she'd find a way to crush me before I even had the chance to fight back. And as the sun set that evening, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen when Mrs. Caldwell realized that I was no longer her puppet. How would she respond when she realized that the very system she had been using to control us was about to be used against her? Would she finally back down, or would she go to even darker extremes to protect her power? I didn't have all the answers yet, but I was getting closer. You know, I always thought that playing by the rules would keep things simple. But the truth is, when you play by someone else's rules, someone like Mrs. Caldwell, it's like walking into a game you didn't even know you were part of. A game where the stakes are high and the other player is ruthless. The day I decided to follow every single rule to the letter was the day I made my move. It wasn't just about fighting back anymore. It was about something deeper, something bigger. It was about showing Mrs. Caldwell just how ridiculous her system really was and how quickly it could turn against her. At first it felt strange. I mean, who really wants to spend their days obsessing over the exact shade of beige on their fence or making sure their mailbox is the exact height the HOA suggests? But I had to do it. I had to prove a point. And honestly, it was almost satisfying to think about her watching from behind her blinds, knowing that I was following her rules, but doing it in a way that would eventually destroy everything she stood for. The first couple of days were the hardest. I trimmed the lawn precisely, right down to the exact measurements the HOA book suggested. Not a single blade of grass was allowed to be over 2.5 inches. I repainted the mailbox with that awful neutral color, scrubbing away any sign of individuality. The perfect little suburban house, exactly how Mrs. Caldwell wanted it, but she didn't know I was doing it for an entirely different reason. As I walked around the neighborhood, I couldn't help but notice how everyone else was looking at me, eyes shifting from behind curtains, a mix of curiosity and suspicion in the air. They all knew what I was doing. They all knew it was a protest, but they were too afraid to say anything out loud. The fear in their eyes said it all. It was only a matter of time before Mrs. Caldwell noticed. And when she did, I knew she'd come after me. That's what I wanted. I needed her to come after me because the more she did, the more it played into my hands. The more she tried to enforce the rules, the more she exposed how flawed the system was. A few days later, my prediction came true. I was in the backyard fixing a broken fence post, another pointless rule to keep the look of the neighborhood perfect, when I saw her. Mrs. Caldwell strutting across the street like she owned it, her gaze locked firmly on my house. I didn't flinch. I didn't try to hide what I was doing. I didn't even acknowledge her. If she wanted to come to me, she could. And she did. "You're doing it all wrong," she said, stepping onto my property, her voice cold and sharp like a knife. She looked around, inspecting everything. "You think following the rules is going to get you anywhere? All you're doing is wasting your time." I smiled. "I'm just following the rules, Mrs. Caldwell. I'm complying with everything your HOA has asked for." I knew my words would sting. They always did with her. "Is there a problem with that?" She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes narrowing. She could sense what I was doing. She knew I was playing her game. But she didn't know that I was playing to win. "I don't appreciate your tone," she snapped, trying to regain control. "And I don't appreciate you mocking the system. This is serious. These rules are in place for a reason." Her voice was venomous now, the facade of politeness slipping. "But aren't the rules supposed to apply to everyone?" I asked, taking a step closer. "Even to the president of the HOA?" Her jaw clenched, and I could see the twitch of frustration in her face. It was a rare sight, seeing Mrs. Caldwell lose her composure. For once, She wasn't in control. She was the one being pushed to the edge. "I will not tolerate this," she said, her voice shaking with anger now. "I'm warning you, stay in line, or there will be consequences." I nodded slowly, like I understood, even though I knew her words meant nothing. She couldn't do anything without exposing herself. Every threat she made only made her more vulnerable. The more she threatened, the more I exposed the cracks in the HOA's authority. That night, I went to bed feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. I had done what I set out to do. I had followed the rules, and I had forced Mrs. Caldwell to react. I knew it wouldn't be long before she tried something more drastic, something that would reveal just how far she was willing to go to maintain control. And the next morning, she proved me right. I woke up to a loud knock on the door, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone using a megaphone. "This is a formal warning," the voice blared, sending a chill through me. "You have 24 hours to remove all non-compliant decorations and restore your house to proper HOA standards. Failure to comply will result in further action." I couldn't help but smile. They had gone too far. Mrs. Caldwell had crossed the line. It wasn't just about the lights anymore. It was about everything she had done. The fines, the threats, the control. She had no idea what was coming next. But as I stood there, staring out at the street, I realized something. I wasn't the only one being watched. I wasn't the only one feeling the weight of Mrs. Caldwell's control. There were other neighbors out there, the ones who had been too afraid to speak up for years. They were tired of living in fear. They were ready to fight back. I wasn't alone in this anymore. And that was when I knew what had to be done. It wasn't just about me and Sarah anymore. It was about all of us. We were going to take down Mrs. Caldwell, together. We were going to show her that the HOA wasn't hers to control, and that the power she had over this neighborhood was nothing more than an illusion. But as I started planning, one question kept gnawing at me. How far would Mrs. Caldwell go to protect her little empire? Would she stop at nothing to keep her control? Or would the people she thought she could manipulate finally take a stand? You ever feel like you're standing on the edge of something big and you can't turn back? That's where I was. The moment Mrs. Caldwell made her threat, it felt like the whole neighborhood was watching, waiting for the next move. But what she didn't realize was that I wasn't the only one who'd had enough. The people in this neighborhood, those quiet, scared faces behind drawn curtains, were finally waking up. They were ready to fight back. They just needed someone to lead them. I was ready to do it. I knew I was playing a dangerous game. Mrs. Caldwell wasn't just some random control freak. She had power. She had the whole HOA behind her, and she'd used it for years to push people around. But it wasn't her power that scared me. No. What scared me was what would happen when she realized the truth, that she was losing control, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I didn't sleep much the night after that warning. I kept going over the same thoughts. Mrs. Caldwell would come after me, but I knew I had to keep pushing. The longer I played her game, the more the cracks in her perfect little world would show. I needed to keep her on her toes, and if I could do that, I might just get the upper hand. But what did I need to do next? I decided to turn the tables on her, and that meant talking to the neighbors, really talking to them. Not just about the lights, not about the lawn, but about the bigger picture. What if we all stopped being afraid? What if we all stood up to her at the same time? The plan started small. I knocked on doors, starting with the ones closest to ours. It wasn't easy. Most of them were hesitant, unsure about getting involved. I could see the fear in their eyes. They were worried about the fines, the legal threats, the idea of being blacklisted by the HOA. But slowly, I started making a dent. "I'm not asking you to break the rules," I told them. "I'm just asking you to stand up for what's right. Mrs. Caldwell has been using the HOA as a tool for her own personal agenda, and we all know it. It's time we stop letting her control us." Some were hesitant, but others nodded. They were tired of it, tired of the fines for having the wrong mailbox, tired of the letters about the height of their grass, tired of living in fear of an invisible authority that could ruin their lives with a simple letter. One by one, they started to come around. But then, something unexpected happened. I was walking home from a neighbor's house when I saw a familiar face standing across the street. It was Mrs. Caldwell. She was watching me, standing there with that cold, calculating smile, the kind of smile you only get when you know you're in control. But as I met her gaze, something flickered in her eyes, something I hadn't seen before. Fear. For the first time, she was scared. I could see it in the way she stood, in the way her shoulders tensed. She knew something was happening, and she didn't know how to stop it. I didn't back down. I stood there, staring at her, watching as the mask of control began to crack. She wasn't the only one who had power anymore. I wasn't the only one playing her game. The whole neighborhood was starting to move, and she could feel it. It wasn't long before the threats started coming in again. More letters, more fines. Mrs. Caldwell was using every tool at her disposal to try to intimidate us back into submission. But this time, it didn't work. The more she pushed, the more people started standing up. It wasn't just me anymore. It was everyone. But that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was knowing that I was about to take this to the next level. I had to expose her for what she was. The fraud. The manipulator who had used her position to control and ruin lives. And that's where the real challenge lay. If I could gather enough evidence, enough people to testify against her, I could finally bring her down. But if I failed, I wouldn't just be fighting Mrs. Caldwell. I'd be fighting the entire HOA. And if they turned on me, I'd be alone. I gathered everything I could. Old emails, financial reports, even testimonies from neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up before. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. She had been pocketing HOA funds, using them for personal vacations, home improvements, and luxury items, while everyone else in the neighborhood suffered under her thumb. I knew that if I could get this information to the right people, it would be over for her. But then came the big question. How far was she willing to go to protect her empire? Mrs. Caldwell wasn't the kind of person who would give up easily. She would fight dirty, and I knew it. I had seen it in her eyes, that flicker of fear that meant she was already preparing for battle. I kept pushing forward, but now it wasn't just about making Mrs. Caldwell uncomfortable. It was about exposing her lies, her manipulation, and her abuse of power. I was getting closer to the truth, closer to the moment when everything would come crashing down. The neighbors were rallying behind me, and with each passing day, it felt like the walls were closing in on Mrs. Caldwell. But there was one thing I still didn't know. How far would she go to protect herself? Would she resort to more extreme measures to try to shut us down? That's when I realized. The next move was hers. And whatever she chose, I was ready. But the real question was, how much was she willing to lose to keep her grip on power? Would she stop at nothing? Sometimes, life throws you a curveball that you never saw coming. Just when you think you've got the upper hand, everything changes. That's exactly what happened to me. I thought I was in control. I thought I had Mrs. Caldwell cornered. But the moment I thought I was winning, I realized I was actually the one in danger. It all started with a knock on the door. It was late, darker than usual for this time of year, a cold wind blowing through the trees outside. I wasn't expecting anyone, not at this hour. When I opened the door, I didn't expect to see who stood on the other side. There, on my doorstep, was the last person I expected to show up, a man in a suit holding a legal briefcase. His face was stern, but his eyes were focused, calculating. He wasn't from the neighborhood. He wasn't even from the HOA office. This was someone new, someone with a purpose. "I'm here on behalf of Mrs. Caldwell," he said, his voice flat and professional. "She's hired me to handle this matter personally. You've been causing quite a stir, haven't you?" I stood there, speechless for a moment. The weight of the words didn't hit me right away. This wasn't just about fines or violations anymore. Mrs. Caldwell had pulled out the big guns. She wasn't just trying to intimidate me. She was going after me with everything she had, and I had no idea how far she was willing to go. "Let's step inside, shall we?" he said, and there was something about the way he said it that made me feel like I had no choice. We sat at the kitchen table, the room filled with a tense silence as I watched him unpack the briefcase. Papers, files, more documents than I'd ever seen in my life. He slid a couple of them toward me, his fingers brushing over the papers like he knew exactly what was coming. "You've been digging into Mrs. Caldwell's affairs, haven't you?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. "I know what you're doing. I've seen the emails, the files, the neighbors who are ready to speak up against her. You're trying to expose her for all the wrong reasons." I didn't flinch. I knew exactly what I was doing. She's been using her position to control this neighborhood. People have suffered because of her. She's taken money that wasn't hers, manipulated everyone for her own gain. I'm not going to let her get away with it. The lawyer's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I know. That's what makes this interesting." He leaned back in his chair, eyes still cold and calculating. "You've gathered all this information thinking you've outsmarted her. But here's the thing, you haven't. You're not the only one who's been watching. Mrs. Caldwell has people everywhere, and now, well, let's just say you've got a bigger problem than you think." I could feel my stomach drop. What was he talking about? A bigger problem? He continued, his voice turning colder with each word. "You think exposing her will bring her down? No. It's going to bring you down. You've already made one mistake by thinking you could fight her on her turf, but now that you've made it personal, now you've crossed the line." I wasn't sure what to say. The air between us was thick, with tension, and for the first time since I'd started this battle, I wasn't sure if I had the upper hand anymore. "Listen," he said, "I'm not here to convince you to stop. No, you've made your choices, but I'll tell you this. You're playing with fire. Mrs. Caldwell has resources, and she's not afraid to use them. You've already gone too far. So here's what's going to happen. You'll stop your little crusade, and I'll make sure you and your wife don't end up in a legal battle that could cost you everything. This is your last warning." I sat there in stunned silence. What was I supposed to do with that? This wasn't just about the HOA anymore. It wasn't about fines or violations. Mrs. Caldwell had dragged me into something far worse. She wasn't just going to let me expose her, she was going to make sure I couldn't do anything about it. Before I could say anything, he stood up, tucking the papers back into his briefcase. He turned to leave, but not before leaving one last chilling piece of advice. "You've made an enemy out of the wrong person. Mrs. Caldwell doesn't lose, and neither do I." As he walked out of the door, I was left standing there, my mind racing. What had just happened? Why was this lawyer so confident? What did he mean by, "You've crossed the line"? And that's when it hit me, the twist I never saw coming. I had been so focused on taking Mrs. Caldwell down, so sure that I could expose her for everything she'd done. But now, I was in deeper than I ever imagined. I had no idea how far this was going to go or how much power she had behind the scenes. This wasn't just about a petty HOA president anymore. I had awakened something much darker than I realized. I was on the brink of losing everything, and I had no idea how to fight back. The game had changed, and I was playing against someone who knew the rules better than I ever could. So I ask you this. What would you do if someone went after you with everything they had, and you found out you were up against a force much stronger than you realized? Would you give up, or would you keep pushing forward even if the odds were stacked against you? I never expected it to go this far. It was one thing to challenge the HOA, but this was something else entirely. After the lawyer's visit, I felt the walls closing in on me. Mrs. Caldwell had more power than I realized, more than I ever could have imagined. She wasn't just some petty neighbor with too much time on her hands. No, she was a mastermind, using every resource at her disposal to control the neighborhood. She had connections, and she wasn't afraid to use them to crush anyone who dared to stand up to her. But then, something shifted in me. I was no longer just fighting for Sarah or even the neighborhood. I was fighting for something deeper, for justice, for truth, for the satisfaction of knowing that I could take down someone who thought they were untouchable. I wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when I was so close to the truth. I spent the next few days preparing. It wasn't just about gathering evidence anymore. No, it was about bringing everything to light. Mrs. Caldwell had dug herself into such a deep hole, and now I was going to be the one to bury her. But I had to be careful. She was watching me, and if I made one wrong move, everything would fall apart. I knew I had to hit her where it hurt the most, her ego, her need to control. And I wasn't going to do it with violence or threats. No, I had something much better in mind. Revenge by compliance. I had followed every rule, played her game, and now I was going to turn it against her. It was all about timing. I waited for the perfect moment. The moment when she would think she had won. The moment when she thought she had me cornered. That's when I would strike. It was a quiet afternoon when the moment came. I had been following the rules, just like she wanted. I had done everything she'd asked, repainted my fence, trimmed the lawn to perfection, even put up a ridiculous perfect neighborhood sign in my front yard, just like she had demanded. It was all part of the plan. She thought she was winning, but she had no idea what I was really up to. As I was out front, trimming the bushes just the way the HOA handbook said, I saw her. Mrs. Caldwell was driving past, her eyes immediately locking onto my house. I could see the smirk on her face, the one that told me she thought she had me. But what she didn't know was that this was my moment, the moment when everything would change. I watched her pull up and park in front of my house. She got out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement. She walked toward me, her smile wide and condescending. "You've really taken this seriously, haven't you?" she said, looking at my house like it was a perfect example of her reign of terror. "Maybe there's hope for you yet. I'm glad you're finally seeing the importance of following the rules." I kept my face neutral. "It's the least I can do," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I figured if I'm going to live here, I might as well follow the guidelines." She smiled again, but it was colder this time. "Good. I'm glad to see you've learned your place. Keep this up, and maybe we'll even reconsider the fines." I nodded, watching her closely. "Maybe. But you know, Mrs. Caldwell, I've been thinking." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't say anything. "I've been following all your rules," I continued, letting my words hang in the air. "Every single one of them. But something's been bothering me." "Bothering you?" she asked, her tone becoming more guarded. "What could possibly bother you?" "Well, I started looking into a few things," I said slowly, letting the tension build. "I started thinking about all the money the HOA has been collecting, and all the fines you've imposed, and I just can't help but wonder, where is all that money going?" She froze for a moment, her smile faltering. It was quick, but I saw it, the smallest flicker of panic in her eyes. "What are you talking about?" she stammered. "Look, Mrs. Caldwell," I said, stepping closer to her. "I know about the trips, the renovations, the luxury items, The things you've been buying with HOA funds, the money that's supposed to be going to the community, but isn't. The money that's been funneled into your pockets. Her face went pale. She took a step back, but I wasn't done yet. I have the proof, you know, I said, pulling out a folder full of documents, receipts, and photos I'd gathered over the past few weeks. I've been talking to your neighbors. They've seen it too. They know what you've been doing, and they're not afraid to speak up anymore. I could see the realization hit her. She had been caught. All her lies, her manipulations, everything was about to come crashing down. The fear in her eyes was real now. She wasn't the one in control anymore. I was. "You can't do this," she yelled, her voice shaking. "You have no right. I'll make sure you regret this." I smiled, knowing she had no idea how deep she was already in. "You've already made that mistake, Mrs. Caldwell. This isn't about revenge anymore. It's about doing what's right. You've hurt too many people for too long. And now, it's time for the truth to come out." I turned to walk back to my house, leaving her standing there in the street, her world crumbling around her. It wasn't just about the lights anymore. It wasn't about a few petty rules. It was about justice. As I walked back toward my front door, I couldn't help but think, was this what it felt like to finally take control? Was this the sweet taste of revenge, or was it something else, something deeper?